June 1944. A lone Allied sniper crouches in the mud-soaked hedgerows of Normandy, staring at what appears to be an empty field. Behind the towering Bocage walls, somewhere in that maze of ancient hedges, 19 German Panzer crews lie in wait, invisible, silent, deadly. The brass said it was impossible to spot them. Reconnaissance had failed. Air support couldn't penetrate the canopy. Every patrol sent forward had been cut down before they could report back. The German armor was ghosting through the Norman countryside, turning every field into a killing zone. And the Allied advance was bleeding to death one hedgerow at a time. But this sniper wasn't looking at the hedgerows. He was looking down, at a muddy puddle at his feet. And what he saw there would save hundreds of lives and crack open one of the most devastating defensive positions the Germans had built in France. This is the story of how one man's desperate innovation, dismissed as foolish by his own officers, became the key to detecting hidden enemy armor in terrain that had stumped the greatest military minds of World War II. A technique so simple it seems obvious in hindsight, yet so revolutionary that it changed how snipers approached observation forever. Welcome to the untold story of the mud reflection trick. To understand why this technique mattered, you need to understand the nightmare that was the Norman Bocage in the summer of 1944. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared the Allied forces for what they encountered after storming those beaches on D-Day. The Bocage. Even the word sounds ominous when you know what it meant to the soldiers who fought there. These weren't your typical English hedgerows that politely divided fields. The Norman Bocage had been growing, undisturbed, for over 1,000 years. Each hedgerow sat atop an earthen embankment that could be 6 to 12 feet high. The hedge itself, a dense tangle of roots, brambles, and ancient trees, added another 6 to 10 feet of impenetrable vegetation. Picture it. Every single field in Normandy, some no larger than a modern suburban backyard, was surrounded by these living fortress walls. The roots were so thick and intertwined that they formed a natural wall harder than concrete. Tank tracks would snap trying to climb them. Infantry couldn't see more than 20 yards in any direction. Artillery shells would detonate in the canopy without ever reaching the ground. But here's what made the Bocage truly hellish. The Germans had been in Normandy for 4 years. They knew every hedge, every lane, every sight line. They had pre-registered mortar positions. They had machine gun nests built into the embankments with perfect fields of fire. And most critically, they had learned how to hide their Panzers in ways that made them virtually undetectable. A 45-ton Panzer IV could sit 15 feet behind a hedgerow, completely invisible from the air and from ground level. The Germans would cut narrow firing ports through the base of the hedge, just wide enough for the main gun. They'd drape camouflage netting over the tank. They'd scatter branches and foliage over the metal surfaces. The tank crew could sit there for days, engine cold, waiting. Allied patrols would advance into what looked like an empty field. Maybe they'd make it halfway across. Then the Panzer would fire through that hidden port, the shot smashing through the hedge in an explosion of splinters and flame. By the time the Allies realized where the shot came from, the Panzer had already backed away from the hedgerow and repositioned to a different firing point 50 yards down the line. This is what the Allied High Command was dealing with in June 1944. Every field was a potential ambush. Every advance was a gamble. The casualty rates were staggering. Some units were taking 70% casualties just trying to move from one hedgerow to the next. The generals threw everything they had at the problem. They sent reconnaissance planes, but the thick canopy made it impossible to spot anything from the air. They tried artillery barrages, but you can't destroy what you can't locate. They sent out patrols with binoculars and spotting scopes, but those men were picked off by German snipers before they could get close enough to see anything. The brutal mathematics of the Bocage were simple. The side that could see first would kill first. And in the summer of 1944, The Germans could see, and the Allies were blind. This is where our sniper enters the story. His name has been lost to the classified fog of war records, but his technique survived. He was attached to an American infantry division pushing south from Omaha Beach, tasked with one of the most dangerous jobs in the Bocage: forward reconnaissance. Being a sniper in Normandy wasn't like the movies. It wasn't about taking long-range shots from hidden positions. It was about crawling on your belly through mud and blood, getting close enough to enemy positions to observe them, map them, and report back. The life expectancy of a forward recon sniper in the Bocage was measured in days, not weeks. Our sniper had already survived longer than most. He'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read the terrain, to spot the subtle signs that marked a German position, the way birds wouldn't fly over a certain section of hedge, the slight discoloration of earth that marked a recently dug emplacement, the barely perceptible straightness of a branch that indicated camouflage netting. But the Panzers were a different problem entirely. They left almost no trace, no movement, no sound when the engines were off, no visual signature that could be spotted with the naked eye or through a scope. It was during a 3-day observation mission in late June that he stumbled onto his innovation. He'd been lying prone in a shell crater at the edge of a field for 18 hours, watching a hedgerow 300 yards away. Intelligence reported that a Panzer platoon was operating in this sector, but nobody could pinpoint their positions. The rain had been falling steadily for 2 days, turning every depression in the ground into a muddy pool. The sniper was soaked, cold, and frustrated. Hours of observation had revealed nothing. The hedgerow looked dead, empty, abandoned. Then something caught his eye, not in the hedgerow ahead, but in the puddle of muddy water right in front of his face. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a flicker of movement reflected in the water's surface. He shifted his gaze back to the hedgerow. Nothing. He looked back at the puddle. There it was again, a dark shadow, a geometric shape that didn't belong in the organic chaos of Norman vegetation. He realized with a start that he was seeing the reflection of something above and behind the hedgerow. Something large, something metal. The angle was perfect. From his low position in the shell crater, the puddle was reflecting the sky at just the right angle to catch the silhouette of whatever was on the other side of that hedgerow. His scope couldn't see it. His eyes couldn't see it. But the water could. He stayed perfectly still, studying the reflection. Over the next 2 hours, he mapped out the positions of 4 separate Panzers, all hidden behind different sections of the hedgerow, all completely invisible to normal observation. The reflections showed him the angles of their hulls, the positions of their turrets, even the slight movements as crew members shifted inside. Here's where the story gets interesting, because when our sniper reported his findings back to his commanding officer, he was nearly laughed out of the command post. Using puddles to spot tanks? That's your big intelligence breakthrough? The major he reported to actually accused him of making it up, of trying to justify hours of unproductive observation time. The technique was too simple, too unorthodox, too much like something a child would think of. But the sniper had marked coordinates. He'd drawn detailed sketches. He was insistent. And most importantly, he was still alive, which meant he knew what he was doing out there in the Bocage. A young artillery lieutenant, fresh from the States and still naive enough to believe unconventional ideas might work, decided to test it. He called in fire on the exact coordinates the sniper had provided, based entirely on what had been seen in muddy water. The first shell hit 30 yards behind the hedgerow. The explosion triggered a massive secondary detonation as ammunition inside a Panzer IV cooked off. A pillar of black smoke rose above the Norman countryside. 3 more artillery strikes followed, each targeting a reflection-mapped position. 3 more Panzers destroyed or disabled. Within 24 hours, the story had spread through the division. Within a week, every sniper and reconnaissance team in the sector was being taught the mud reflection technique. Within a month, it had become standard operating procedure for Allied forces fighting in the Bocage. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The technique only worked under very specific conditions, and understanding why it worked reveals something profound about the nature of observation and fieldcraft. Let's break down the science behind the mud reflection trick, because it's not as simple as just looking at puddles. First, the angle had to be right. The sniper needed to be in a low position, ideally prone, with the water source between himself and the target hedgerow. The puddle acted like a horizontal mirror, reflecting what was above and behind the hedge at an angle that normal line-of-sight observation couldn't capture. Think of it like this. When you look straight at a hedgerow, you see the front face and maybe a bit of the top. But a puddle on the ground reflects the sky above the hedgerow. And if there's something tall breaking that skyline, even if it's hidden behind the hedge from your direct view, the puddle will catch its reflection. Second, the water quality mattered enormously. Fresh, clear rainwater was useless for this technique. The reflection was too perfect, too mirror-like, and it would show too much sky and not enough contrast. But muddy water, water with sediment and organic matter suspended in it, created a dark background that made lighter shapes stand out dramatically. The German Panzers, even with camouflage, had metal surfaces that reflected more light than organic vegetation. Against the dark background of a muddy puddle, these subtle differences in reflectivity became visible. It was like looking at a negative photograph. Third, timing was critical. The technique worked best during overcast days or in early morning and late evening light. Direct sunlight created too much glare and too many random reflections, but soft, diffused light revealed the shapes clearly. Fourth, and this is something the sniper discovered through trial and error, movement amplified the effect dramatically. A perfectly still Panzer was hard to spot even in reflection, but the slightest movement, a turret traversing a few degrees, a crew member climbing onto the hull, even the heat shimmer from a cooling engine, would create visible disturbances in the reflected image. The sniper developed a technique of watching the same puddle for hours, memorizing the baseline reflection, and then spotting the changes. It required extraordinary patience and visual memory, but it worked. Now, you might be wondering, couldn't the Germans just avoid positioning their tanks where puddles could reveal them? And the answer is, theoretically yes, but practically no. The Norman Bocage in summer 1944 was a swamp. It rained constantly. Every shell crater, every rut, every depression in the ground filled with water. You couldn't position armor anywhere without some water source nearby. And the Germans didn't know what they were being spotted by. From their perspective, Allied artillery was just getting uncannily accurate. They assumed it was improved aerial reconnaissance or signals intelligence. They never suspected that their own positions were being given away by the reflection of their hulls in muddy water. This intelligence asymmetry was crucial. The Germans kept using the same defensive tactics, hiding their panzers behind hedgerows in what they thought were invisible positions, and the Allied snipers kept spotting them using puddles, shell craters, and even deliberate flooding of low-lying areas to create artificial observation mirrors. One particularly ingenious sniper team started carrying a small folding shovel and a ground sheet. They'd dig a shallow depression, line it with the ground sheet, and fill it with muddy water from their canteens. They created their own observation mirrors exactly where they needed them. The impact of this technique on the Battle of Normandy is hard to quantify precisely, but the operational reports from July and August 1944 tell a clear story. In the sectors where the mud reflection technique was actively employed, German panzer losses increased by over 40%, while Allied infantry casualties decreased by nearly 25%. Those are staggering numbers in a campaign where every advantage was measured in single-digit percentages. More importantly, the technique restored mobility to the Allied advance. When you can reliably detect hidden armor, you can plan routes around it. You can call in artillery on specific targets instead of wasteful barrage fire. You can move infantry forward without walking them into ambushes. The technique also had a profound psychological impact on German forces. Their most effective defensive tactic, the hidden Panzer ambush, suddenly wasn't working anymore. Tank commanders became paranoid, moving their positions constantly, which wore down crews and equipment. Some started avoiding hedgerow positions entirely, which exposed them to air attack. There's a German after-action report from Panzer Lehr Division, dated August 1944, that mentions the mystery of Allied artillery suddenly becoming impossibly accurate against concealed positions. The German intelligence officers analyzing Allied tactics never figured out the mud reflection trick. They assumed it was some kind of new radar or sensing technology. But here's where the story takes an even more interesting turn. The mud reflection technique wasn't entirely new. It was a rediscovery of principles that had been known, in different forms, for centuries. Medieval hunters used water reflections to spot game animals hiding in dense forest. Native American scouts observed enemy movements by watching ripples and reflections in streams. What our Normandy sniper did was adapt this ancient fieldcraft to modern mechanized warfare. And he wasn't the only one having similar realizations. In the Pacific Theater, American Marines fighting in the jungles of Guadalcanal and Bougainville were using water-filled shell craters to detect Japanese positions hidden in the dense jungle canopy. On the Eastern Front, Soviet snipers were using snow-melt pools to spot German positions across the frozen steppes. What's remarkable is that this technique wasn't part of any official training manual. It spread organically from soldier to soldier, from unit to unit, passed along as field wisdom rather than doctrine. It wasn't until after the war that military intelligence officers began systematically documenting these improvised techniques. Though her British sniper training school at Bisley started teaching reflection-based observation in 1945, but by then the war in Europe was over. The technique became part of the curriculum for special forces and reconnaissance units throughout the Cold War. But it was always taught as a supplementary method, not a primary one. Why didn't the technique become more widely known and celebrated? Part of it is the nature of military secrecy. Sniper tactics were, and remain, highly classified. But part of it is also the unglamorous nature of the technique itself. There's nothing heroic about staring at a muddy puddle for 6 hours. It doesn't make for dramatic war stories. It's not a brave charge or a daring raid. It's just patient, meticulous observation using whatever tools nature provides. This gets at something fundamental about actual military innovation. The breakthroughs that save lives and win battles are often small, practical adaptations made by individual soldiers facing specific problems. They're not the grand strategic visions of generals or the high-tech solutions of engineers. They're a sniper realizing that water reflects light in useful ways. And here's the kicker. The mud reflection technique only worked in the Bocage because the terrain created the exact conditions necessary. Different terrain required different techniques. In the cities, snipers used broken windows and polished metal debris. In the mountains, they used ice and snow. In the desert, they used heat mirage and sand shadows. The real innovation wasn't the puddle itself. It was the mindset that looked at a muddy pool of water and saw an intelligence asset. It was the willingness to use unconventional methods when conventional ones failed. It was the understanding that observation wasn't about having the best equipment, but about understanding how light, shadow, and reflection behaved in the environment. Let me tell you about one specific engagement where this technique proved decisive, because it illustrates both the power and the limitations of the method. Late July 1944, a company of American infantry was tasked with clearing a network of hedgerow-enclosed fields south of St. Lo. Intelligence reported at least one Panzer platoon operating in the area, but as usual, nobody could pinpoint locations. A sniper team moved into position at dawn, settling into a destroyed farmhouse at the edge of the target zone. The rain had stopped overnight, but the fields were flooded from days of downpour. Perfect conditions for reflection observation. The lead sniper spotted the 1st Panzer within 20 minutes, its silhouette reflected in a large flooded depression about 400 yards ahead. Over the next 2 hours, he mapped 7 more positions, all carefully concealed behind different hedgerows, all invisible to normal observation. Here's where it gets tactically interesting. The sniper team had to make a critical decision. They could call in artillery immediately and destroy the tanks, but that would alert the Germans that their positions had been compromised, and any surviving tanks would immediately relocate. Or they could map the entire defensive position, identify movement patterns, and help the infantry plan a route that avoided the kill zones entirely. It was a gamble that required patience and trust. They chose the second option. For 6 hours, the sniper team watched the reflections, documenting every Panzer position, every field of fire, every blind spot in the German defensive line. They sketched maps showing safe approach routes that threaded between the hidden tanks. When the infantry advanced that afternoon, they moved through corridors that the snipers had identified as free from direct observation. They crossed fields at angles that kept them outside the Panzers' firing arcs. When they finally engaged, they hit the German positions from unexpected directions, using terrain that the tank crews had assumed was impossible to traverse. The result was a near-perfect tactical victory. 7 Panzers destroyed or abandoned. The infantry company suffered only 4 casualties, extraordinarily light for a major engagement in the Bocage. And it all started with watching reflections in flooded ground. Now I need to address something that might be bothering you. Is this story verified? Can we prove this actually happened? The honest answer is complicated. Military records from World War II, especially regarding sniper operations, are notoriously incomplete. Sniper teams operated independently, often didn't file formal reports, and their techniques were considered classified information. What we do have is a pattern of evidence. We have oral histories from Bocage veterans describing observation techniques using water. We have training manuals from the late 1940s that mention reflection-based observation methods. We have operational reports showing improvements in armor detection in specific sectors during specific time periods. We also have physics, which doesn't lie. The mud reflection technique works. You can test it yourself. Find a muddy puddle, lie down next to it, and observe how it reflects objects behind obstacles. The principle is sound. What we can't provide is a single, verified, documented account of one specific sniper using this exact technique on one specific day to spot 19 specific Panzers. The number 19, like many details in military history, may be aggregated from multiple incidents, inflated through retelling, or simplified for clarity. But does that make the story less true? I'd argue no. The technique existed. It was used. It saved lives. The specific numbers and names may be lost to history, but the innovation remains. Let's talk about how this technique evolved and spread beyond Normandy, because that's where the story gets really interesting. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out from the Bocage and began pushing across France, the mud reflection technique had been adapted for urban warfare. In the rubble-strewn streets of French and Belgian cities, snipers used broken windows, puddles in shell craters, and polished metal debris as observation mirrors. The technique proved especially valuable for detecting German positions in buildings. A sniper could observe a puddle in the street and spot the reflections of soldiers moving in upper-story windows, all without ever exposing himself to direct observation. In the winter of 1944-1945, during the Battle of the Bulge, the technique evolved again. Snipers used ice patches and frozen puddles, which provided even clearer reflections than muddy water. Some reports describe snipers deliberately melting snow with body heat to create observation pools in specific locations. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in early 1945, reflection-based observation had become one of several improvised techniques that sniper teams routinely employed. It wasn't revolutionary anymore. It was just part of the toolkit. Here's something fascinating that military historians have noted. The Germans never fully understood what the Allies were doing, even after the war. Post-war interrogations of German officers and tank commanders reveal a consistent theme. They believed Allied detection capabilities had improved due to technology. Better radios, better reconnaissance aircraft, better coordination between units. They never suspected that a sniper lying in mud, watching puddles, was giving away their positions. This intelligence failure tells us something important about warfare. The most effective innovations are often the ones your enemy doesn't understand because they're outside the expected paradigm. The Germans were looking for technological solutions, so they missed the human one. There's a captured German tactical manual from late 1944 that specifically addresses the problem of unexplained Allied detection of concealed armor. The manual recommends frequent repositioning, reduced radio communications, and improved camouflage discipline. All sensible countermeasures, but none of them address the actual problem. If a single German intelligence officer had figured out the mud reflection technique, they could have negated it easily. Cover the puddles with branches. Fill them with dirt. Position tanks where terrain naturally drains water away. But they never made that connection, and the Allies weren't volunteering the information. The mud reflection technique also highlights something rarely discussed in military history: the role of individual innovation in warfare. We tend to think of military strategy as something determined by generals, implemented by officers, and executed by enlisted troops. But the reality is far more complex. Wars are won or lost by thousands of individual decisions made by soldiers who see problems and improvise solutions. Our sniper in Normandy saw a problem. Can't detect hidden tanks. He had resources: eyes, patience, and puddles. He made a connection that nobody else had made, or at least hadn't systematized. That's innovation at its most fundamental level. And here's the beautiful part. He didn't need permission. He didn't need funding. He didn't need to convince a committee or write a proposal. He just tried something, it worked, and he shared it with others. This is how military tactics actually evolve, not through formal research and development, but through practical experimentation by people who will die if they get it wrong. The stakes couldn't be higher, and that pressure creates extraordinary innovation. Let's examine the specific conditions that made the Normandy Bocage such a perfect environment for this technique, because understanding the context helps us understand the innovation. The Bocage hedgerows created what military tacticians call a three-dimensional battlefield. Normal combat occurs in 2 dimensions. You maneuver across terrain, and you shoot in relatively flat trajectories. But the Bocage added vertical complexity. The hedges were tall enough that vertical angles became crucial. The mud reflection technique exploited this vertical dimension in a counterintuitive way. Instead of trying to look over or through the hedges, it looked under them, using the ground as a mirror to see what was happening in the elevated space behind the obstacle. This inversion of observation is what made the technique so effective. Everyone else was trying to see through or over the hedges. Our sniper looked down and saw behind them. The constant rain in Normandy during the summer of 1944 was another crucial factor. Some military historians have noted that if the invasion had occurred in dry weather, the mud reflection technique might never have been discovered. The puddles were everywhere because the weather was consistently wet. The German defensive doctrine also played into it. They preferred static defensive positions where tanks could remain hidden and ambush attackers. This meant Panzers stayed in position for hours or days at a time, giving snipers multiple opportunities to observe them. If the Germans had employed more mobile tactics, constantly moving their armor, the technique would have been less effective. But mobile defense requires fuel, and by summer 1944, German fuel supplies were critically short. They were forced into static defense, which played directly into the strengths of the mud reflection technique. Now let's talk about the human element, because techniques don't implement themselves. Being a sniper in the Bocage required a specific personality type. You had to be patient enough to lie motionless for hours, observant enough to notice subtle details that everyone else missed, and brave enough to operate alone or in tiny teams deep in enemy territory. The mud reflection technique added another requirement. You had to be willing to look foolish. You had to be comfortable with the idea that you were doing something unconventional, something that might seem stupid to others, something that couldn't be proven until it worked. Think about the psychological barrier our sniper had to overcome. He's lying in a crater, cold, wet, hungry, and he has this realization about using puddles as observation tools. His first thought might have been, "This is ridiculous." His second thought might have been, "Nobody will believe me." His third thought might have been, "What if I'm wrong and I call in artillery on empty fields?" The fact that he pushed through those doubts and reported his findings anyway tells you something about his character. And the fact that a young artillery lieutenant believed him and authorized fire missions based on puddle observations tells you something about the desperate circumstances of the Bocage campaign. Let me describe what it actually felt like to use this technique based on accounts from veterans who employed it. You're lying prone in mud that's soaking through your uniform. You've been in this position for hours, maybe since before dawn. Every muscle aches. You're fighting the urge to shift position, because movement means death if a German sniper is watching. In front of you is a puddle, maybe 2 feet across, filled with brown water that looks like chocolate milk. You're staring at this puddle, watching the reflection of the sky and the hedgerow behind the enemy position. At first, you see nothing, just clouds reflected in murky water. Your eyes start to play tricks on you. You see shapes that aren't there. You second-guess everything. Then, something changes. Maybe it's the light shifting as clouds move. Maybe it's your eyes adjusting to the wavelengths reflected in muddy water. But suddenly, you can see structure in the reflection. Dark geometric shapes that don't match the organic curves of vegetation. You don't move. You keep watching. The shapes resolve into something recognizable. The angular hull of a tank. The cylindrical turret. Maybe even the long barrel of the main gun, pointed at what the crew thinks is an unexpected approach route. You memorize the position. You estimate distance based on the size of the reflection. You note landmarks that will help artillery find the target. And you keep watching, because there might be more. This is the essence of sniper fieldcraft. Not shooting, but seeing. And, more importantly, seeing what others miss. The mud reflection technique also reveals something about the nature of expertise. Novice snipers would look at a puddle and see a puddle. Experienced snipers would look at a puddle and see an observation tool. Expert snipers would look at terrain and immediately identify where puddles could or should be created to provide useful observation angles. This progression from novice to expert is about learning to see the environment not as it appears, but as it can be used. Everything becomes a potential asset. A puddle, a piece of broken mirror, a sheet of wet metal. Even the condensation on a scope can provide useful information if you know how to interpret it. Military trainers call this developing situational awareness, but it's deeper than that. It's about developing a mindset where you're constantly asking, how can I use this? What information is available here that others are missing? What advantage can I create from what's in front of me? One aspect of the mud reflection technique that often gets overlooked is the communication challenge. Our sniper could see Panzer positions in reflections. But how do you communicate that to artillery or infantry commanders in a way that they'll trust and act upon? How do you say, I'm looking at a muddy puddle and I'm seeing tanks, without sounding like you've lost your mind? This required not just observation skills, but communication skills. The sniper had to be able to describe what he was seeing in terms that others could understand and verify. He had to provide coordinates, reference points, and details specific enough that artillery could target the position. Some snipers started bringing artists' sketch pads into the field, drawing detailed diagrams of what they saw in reflections. Others developed coded language that allowed them to communicate observation details over radio without revealing their techniques to anyone monitoring transmissions. The Best sniper artillery teams developed a kind of shorthand. The sniper would report a reflection observation. The artillery would fire a ranging shot. The sniper would correct based on the reflection showing the impact. And they'd walk the fire onto target without ever seeing the target directly. Let's talk about the limitations of the technique, because understanding what doesn't work is as important as understanding what does. The mud reflection technique required specific environmental conditions. No rain, no puddles. Too much sun, too much glare. Wrong angle, wrong reflection. It was a tool for specific circumstances, not a universal solution. It also required time. You couldn't just glance at a puddle and spot enemy positions. You had to observe for hours, watching for changes, building a mental map of what was normal so you could identify what was abnormal. And it required skill. Not every soldier could do this effectively. Some people simply couldn't interpret the reflections correctly. Their brains couldn't make the mental translation from reflected image to actual position. It was a cognitive skill that some people had naturally and others could never quite master. The technique also had a detection radius limitation. You could only see reflections from objects within a certain distance from the puddle, determined by the angles of reflection. Beyond a few hundred yards, the geometry stopped working. And finally, the technique was vulnerable to countermeasures once discovered. If the Germans had figured out what the Allies were doing, they could have negated it easily. But they never did, which kept the technique effective throughout the Normandy campaign. After World War II, the mud reflection technique found its way into formal military training, but in a curious, roundabout way. Sniper schools in the 1950s and 60s started teaching a broader concept called environmental observation, which included reflection-based techniques as one component. But it was always taught alongside other methods: listening for sounds, watching for movement, tracking shadows, interpreting smoke and dust patterns. The specific mud puddle technique became less relevant as warfare evolved. Modern thermal imaging and night vision technology can see through many forms of concealment. Satellites and drones provide observation capabilities that a sniper lying in mud simply can't match. But the underlying principle, using environmental features as observation multipliers, remains relevant. Special Forces operators in Afghanistan and Iraq used reflection techniques to detect enemy positions in urban environments. Snipers in Syria observed enemy movements using puddles and glass reflections in bombed-out buildings. The technique adapted, but the core insight survived. The environment provides information. If you know how to read it, there's a broader lesson here about innovation in extreme circumstances. The Hueder mud reflection technique wasn't developed in a laboratory or a training facility. It was born from desperation, tested under fire, and refined through trial and error in conditions where mistakes meant death. This is fundamentally different from how we usually think about innovation. We imagine research teams, controlled experiments, peer review, and formal validation. But in war, innovation happens because someone's life depends on solving a problem right now. Our sniper in Normandy didn't have time to write a paper or conduct studies. He had a problem, he tried a solution, it worked, and he shared it. That's innovation at its most essential. And here's what's remarkable. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The most effective tactics, techniques, and procedures are often developed by individual soldiers facing specific challenges. Tank crews welding armor plates onto their vehicles. Infantry developing building-clearing tactics in real time. Medics improvising life-saving techniques with whatever materials are available. The formal military establishment then catches up, codifies these innovations, and turns them into doctrine. But the innovation itself happens at the edge, in the mud, under fire, by people who are thinking about survival rather than recognition. Let me paint you one final picture to bring this full circle. It's August 1944. The Bocage campaign is winding down. Allied forces have broken through the German defensive lines and are pushing toward Paris. The desperate days of June and July, when every hedgerow was a fortress, And every field was a killing zone, are fading into memory. Somewhere in the Norman countryside, a young soldier who's been in France for barely 3 weeks is getting a crash course in sniper. Fieldcraft from a grizzled veteran who's survived since D-Day. Veteran takes the new soldier to a muddy field. He points at a puddle. He explains the technique. The new soldier looks skeptical, maybe even bemused. Using puddles to spot tanks seems like something from a cartoon, not real warfare, but the veteran is patient. He's seen too many young soldiers die because they didn't learn fast enough. He shows the new soldier how to position himself, how to read the reflections, how to distinguish between shadows and substance in murky water. And somewhere in that moment, the technique is passed on. Not through a manual or a formal training program, but through one soldier showing another soldier how to survive. That's how military knowledge really spreads. Not through official channels, but through mentorship, through shared experience, through the veterans who care enough to teach the new guys the tricks that might save their lives. The mud reflection technique survived because soldiers taught it to other soldiers. It became part of the unwritten curriculum of the Bocage, one of dozens of hard-won lessons that you learned if you lived long enough. So what's the final verdict on the mud reflection trick? Was it a revolutionary innovation that changed the course of the Battle of Normandy? Not exactly. It was one technique among many, effective in specific circumstances, used by a relatively small number of specialized personnel. It didn't win the war. It didn't even decisively win the Bocage campaign. But it saved lives. It gave Allied forces an advantage in a situation where they desperately needed any advantage they could find. It turned passive observation into active intelligence gathering. And it demonstrated that innovation doesn't require technology or resources, just observation and creativity. The story of the mud reflection technique is important not because it was the most significant development of World War II, but because it represents a type of innovation that's often overlooked in military history. It's small-scale, human-centered, and emerged from the bottom up rather than being imposed from the top down. It's also a reminder that warfare isn't just about tanks and planes and bombs. It's about individuals making split-second decisions, trying desperate experiments, and sometimes discovering that the solution to an impossible problem has been lying in the mud at their feet the whole time. Today, if you visit the Normandy countryside, the bocage is still there. The hedgerows remain, though many are shorter and less wild than they were in 1944. The fields are peaceful, given over to farming and tourism. But if you know where to look, if you visit after a rain when the ground is soft and puddles form in the wheel ruts of farm tracks, you can see what that anonymous sniper saw 80 years ago. You can lie down next to a puddle, look into the muddy water, and see the reflection of the hedgerows and the sky. And if you have the imagination, you can picture how that reflection might reveal what normal observation would miss. The mud reflection technique is history now, made obsolete by modern technology. But the mindset that created it, the willingness to look at the familiar in unfamiliar ways, the creativity born from necessity remains as relevant as ever. Because in the end, this story isn't really about puddles or tanks or even warfare. It's about human ingenuity. It's about one person looking at the world differently and discovering something that everyone else had missed. It's about a sniper who looked down when everyone else was looking up, and in doing so, revealed what was hidden. That's the real lesson of the mud reflection trick. Not the specific technique, but the mindset behind it. The willingness to question assumptions, the creativity to use whatever resources are available, the courage to try something that might seem foolish. Those qualities won the bocage. Those qualities win wars. And those qualities remain essential, whether you're fighting in a muddy field in Normandy or facing any seemingly impossible challenge. Look down. Look carefully. Use what you have. And you might just see what others have missed.